He was just the janitor, until the bullies disrespected his daughter. Marcus Rivera had always been invisible at Westfield High School. At 17, he was tall but lanky, with calloused hands that bore the evidence of after-school work, mopping floors and emptying trash cans alongside his father. While other students rushed past him in designer clothes and expensive sneakers, Marcus wore the same 3 faded shirts and worn jeans, rotating them throughout the week. His backpack was held together with duct tape, and his lunch consisted of whatever leftover sandwiches his father could salvage from the faculty lounge. The other students barely acknowledged his existence, except when they needed someone to look down upon. Marcus was the janitor's son, the kid who cleaned up their messes, literally and figuratively. His father, Eduardo Rivera, had worked at Westfield High for 15 years, arriving before dawn to prepare the school and staying long after the final bell to restore order to the chaos left behind by hundreds of teenagers. What nobody at Westfield High knew was that Eduardo Rivera had once been Eduardo El Martillo Rivera, the hammer of the underground fighting circuit in Mexico City. Before immigration, before his wife's death, before single parenthood reduced him to pushing a mop cart through sterile hallways, he had been feared in rings across 3 countries. His hands, now gentle as they guided Marcus through homework, each night had once delivered knockout punches that ended careers. Marcus had inherited more than his father's work ethic. In their small apartment above Mrs. Chen's restaurant, Eduardo had spent countless hours teaching his son the discipline that had made him legendary. Not just the physical techniques, the precise footwork, the devastating combinations, the ability to read an opponent's intentions in their shoulders and hips, but the mental fortitude that separated true fighters from mere brawlers. A real warrior fights only when he must, mijo, Eduardo would say as they practiced in their cramped living room, furniture pushed against the walls. And when he fights to end it quickly and completely. Marcus understood. He had watched his father endure countless small humiliations at school, students who deliberately knocked over trash cans, teachers who spoke to him like he was invisible, parents who acted as if he didn't deserve basic courtesy. Eduardo absorbed it all with quiet dignity, never allowing his past to surface, never letting anyone see the fire that still burned beneath his weathered exterior. The bullying began in Marcus's junior year when Chase Brennan noticed him. Chase was everything Marcus wasn't: captain of the lacrosse team, son of the town's most prominent lawyer, owner of a BMW that cost more than Marcus's family made in 2 years. With his perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe, Chase embodied the casual cruelty of privilege. "Well, well," Chase announced one Monday morning as Marcus navigated the crowded hallway. "If it isn't the janitor's boy. Tell me, Rivera, do you get employee discounts on toilet paper?" His friends, Jake Morrison and Brett Collins, equally blessed with wealth and athleticism, laughed appreciatively. Marcus kept walking, books clutched tightly against his chest, pretending he hadn't heard, but Chase wasn't finished. "I'm talking to you, garbage boy." Chase stepped directly into Marcus's path, forcing him to stop. "My dad's on the school board, you know. One word from him and your daddy might find himself looking for a new job." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, his father's training whispering through his muscles. One quick combination, a feint to the body, followed by an uppercut that would lift Chase clean off his feet. It would be over before anyone could react. Instead, Marcus stepped around Chase and continued down the hallway. He couldn't risk his father's job. Eduardo worked too hard, sacrificed too much, for Marcus to ruin everything with a moment of anger. The incidents escalated. Chase and his friends began timing their harassment to Marcus's most vulnerable moments. In the cafeteria, they would accidentally bump into him, sending his lunch tray flying across the floor while he scrambled to clean up the mess his father would eventually have to mop. In the hallways, they would knock books from his hands, then kick them down the corridor while other students watched and did nothing. "Oops," Brett would say with exaggerated innocence. "Clumsy me." The worst part wasn't the physical harassment, it was the systematic humiliation. Chase had a talent for timing his attacks. When the maximum number of students could witness Marcus's degradation, he would wait until the hallway was crowded between classes, then loudly announce some new nickname: Mop Boy, Trash Prince, the janitor's little helper. Other students began to join in, not out of malice but out of the desperate desire to align themselves with power rather than become targets themselves. Soon, half the school was calling him Mop Boy, and teachers who might have intervened pretended not to notice. Marcus absorbed it all in silence, his father's words echoing in his mind. A warrior chooses his battles, mijo. Not every fight is worth fighting. But Eduardo noticed the changes in his son, the way Marcus's shoulders hunched when he walked, the silence that stretched longer at their dinner table, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of nights spent, staring at the ceiling, replaying humiliations and imagining different outcomes. "Talk to me, Marcus," Eduardo said one evening as they practiced their forms in the living room. "What troubles you?" Marcus threw a combination at the heavy bag they'd hung from the ceiling beam. Left hook, right cross, left uppercut. Each punch carried weight beyond the physical. "It's nothing, Papa. Just school stuff." Eduardo caught the bag as it swung back. "I see how you carry yourself now. Like a man defeated. That is not the son I raised." "You don't understand," Marcus said, frustrated. "If I fight back, they'll come after you. Chase's father." "Ah," Eduardo nodded slowly. "So you protect me by allowing them to destroy you." "I can handle it." "No, mijo. You are handling nothing. You are enduring. There is a difference." But Marcus couldn't explain the complexity of his situation. How could he tell his father that every day was a carefully calculated navigation of corridors and timing, designed to minimize contact with his tormentors? How could he describe the way other students now looked through him, as if Chase's campaign had made him literally invisible to anyone who might have been a potential friend? The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. Marcus was walking past the gymnasium when he heard voices from inside, Chase and his friends, presumably having stayed after lacrosse practice. But as he got closer, he realized they weren't alone. "Please," a female voice was saying, "just leave me alone." Marcus peered through the gymnasium's window and felt his blood turn to ice. Sofia Delgado, a quiet sophomore who worked part-time in the library, was backed against the bleachers by Chase and his friends. Her school uniform was disheveled, her usually neat ponytail askew. "Come on, Sophie," Chase was saying, his voice taking on a tone Marcus had never heard before, something predatory and cruel. "You can't tell me you're not curious. A girl like you working so hard to fit in here. Maybe you need someone to show you how things really work at Westfield." Jake and Brett flanked her, effectively cutting off any escape route. Sophia clutched her books against her chest like a shield, her eyes wide with fear. "I have to go," she whispered. "My father's expecting me." "Your father?" Chase laughed. "The janitor, right? Just like Mop Boy's daddy. Maybe it runs in families, settling for scraps." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, like a gear clicking into place. Sophia's father was Eduardo's co-worker, a gentleman who sent half his paycheck back to Guatemala to support his extended family. Sophia herself had never spoken to Marcus directly, but he'd noticed her kindness, the way she helped struggling students in the library, how she always said good morning to the custodial staff. "Tell you what," Chase continued, stepping closer to Sophia. "You be nice to me, and maybe I'll put in a good word with my dad. Make sure your father keeps his job. These days you never know what might happen to the help." The threat was clear, and Marcus watched Sophia's face crumble as she realized the impossible position she was in, the same trap that had kept Marcus silent for months, but Marcus was done being silent. He pushed through the gymnasium doors with enough force to make them bang against the walls. The sound echoed through the space like a gunshot. "Let her go." His voice was steady, calm even, but something in his tone made all four figures freeze. Chase turned around, his face shifting from surprise to amusement. Well, if it isn't the cavalry." Chase's smirk widened. "What are you going to do, Mop Boy? Clean us to death?" Marcus walked steadily across the gymnasium floor, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. With each step, years of his father's training crystallized in his muscles. His breathing settled into the rhythm Eduardo had taught him. His hands, which had spent so many afternoons learning to mop floors, remembered older lessons about balance and leverage and the precise application of force. "Sophia," Marcus said, without taking his eyes off Chase. "Go home." She started to move, but Jake stepped sideways to block her path. "I don't think so. We weren't finished here." Marcus continued his approach. 20 feet, 15, 10. "You really want to do this?" Chase asked, genuinely puzzled. "You know what happens to people who cross me, right?" "My father." "Your father isn't here," Marcus said quietly. Something in his tone finally registered. Chase's confidence wavered for just a moment, replaced by uncertainty. He was accustomed to intimidation working, to the mere mention of his family's influence being sufficient to end any challenge. But the boy walking toward him showed no signs of backing down. "Brett, Jake," Chase said, his voice slightly less sure than before. "Maybe it's time Mop Boy learned some respect." They moved toward Marcus simultaneously, expecting easy victory. After all, he was just the janitor's son, thin, quiet, unassuming. What threat could he possibly pose? Marcus slipped Brett's wild swing with fluid grace, stepped inside Jake's guard and delivered a sharp elbow to his solar plexus. Jake doubled over, gasping, and Marcus spun away from Brett's follow-up attempt, catching him with a back fist that sent him stumbling backward into the bleachers. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds. Chase stared in shock as his friends struggled to catch their breath. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The janitor's son was supposed to cower, to apologize, to know his place. "What the hell?" Chase breathed. Marcus faced him directly now, his stance balanced and ready. Years of practice in cramped apartments had prepared him for this moment. Not just the physical techniques, but the mental clarity that came with accepting the inevitable. "Last chance," Marcus said. "Walk away." Chase's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. Being challenged was bad enough, but being challenged successfully in front of witnesses threatened the very foundation of his identity. He couldn't allow this to stand. "You think you're tough?" Chase snarled, charging forward with the reckless abandon of someone who had never faced real consequences. Marcus sidestepped the clumsy attack and caught Chase with a precise combination, a jab to the nose followed by a hook to the body that lifted him onto his toes. Chase staggered backward, blood streaming from his nose, his expensive shirt torn. "This isn't over," Chase gasped, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied calmly. Jake and Brett were slowly getting to their feet, but neither showed any inclination to continue the fight. They had seen enough to understand that they were facing something far beyond their experience. Sophia had pressed herself against the wall, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. When Marcus turned to her, his expression immediately softened. "Are you okay?" She nodded wordlessly, still processing what she had just witnessed. "Go home," Marcus said gently. "Tell your father that if anyone bothers you again, he should talk to mine." As Sophia gathered her scattered books and hurried toward the exit, Marcus turned back to Chase and his friends. They were regrouping, trying to salvage some dignity from their defeat, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "If you ever," Chase started to say. "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't get to make threats anymore. You don't get to intimidate people who can't fight back. And if I ever see you cornering anyone like that again, what just happened will seem gentle." The promise hung in the air with absolute credibility. Chase opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time in his privileged life, he had encountered someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. Marcus walked out of the gymnasium with measured steps, leaving behind 3 boys who were beginning to understand that their reign of casual cruelty had come to an abrupt end. Word of the confrontation spread through Westfield High with the speed of wildfire. By the next morning, every student had heard some version of the story, most of them heavily embellished but all containing the same essential truth. The quiet janitor's son had dismantled Chase Brennan and his crew with surgical precision. The reactions were mixed. Some students who had been victims of Chase's bullying felt a vicarious satisfaction at his comeuppance. Others, particularly those who had aligned themselves with his power, were uncertain how to navigate this new reality. But the most significant change was in how people looked at Marcus himself. The invisibility that had once been a burden became a kind of mystique. Students who had never noticed him before began to reassess their assumptions. Teachers who had overlooked him started paying attention. Chase, for his part, seemed to shrink in the aftermath of his defeat. His nose healed, crookedly, giving him a permanently lopsided appearance that undermined his previous aura of untouchable perfection. More importantly, the casual confidence with which he had terrorized other students evaporated. He still carried himself with arrogance, but there was an underlying uncertainty now, a knowledge that his power had limits. Marcus returned to his routine of quiet invisibility, but it was different now. The silence that surrounded him was no longer born of dismissal, but of respect, and perhaps a touch of wariness. He still cleaned up after other students' messes, still wore the same 3 faded shirts, still carried his duct-taped backpack. But everything had changed. One afternoon, as Marcus was walking past the gymnasium where his transformation had begun, he found Sophia waiting by the doors. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did." Marcus shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Sophia said firmly, "they wouldn't have. I've been at this school for 2 years, and you're the first person who ever stood up when it mattered." They walked together in comfortable silence for a few moments before Sophia spoke again. "My father told me something interesting. He said your dad used to be somebody important before he came here. Marcus glanced at her sideways. What do you mean? He said there are stories about a fighter in Mexico who could end fights with one punch. Eduardo Rivera, they called him El Martillo. Marcus felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. His father's past was supposed to be a secret, but secrets had a way of surfacing among people who paid attention. Maybe, Marcus said noncommittally. He also said that strength skips generations sometimes, but it never really disappears. That evening, Marcus found his father waiting in their living room, the furniture already pushed aside for their evening training session. But instead of beginning their usual routine, Eduardo studied his son with new eyes. I heard about yesterday, Eduardo said finally. Marcus tensed, unsure whether he was about to be praised or scolded. The girl's father thanked me, Eduardo continued. Said his daughter came home different, stronger, like she remembered she doesn't have to accept being treated badly. I couldn't just watch, Marcus said. No, you couldn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about the man you're becoming. Eduardo handed Marcus a pair of worn boxing gloves, the same ones he had used in competition years before. I think it's time to expand your education, mijo. There are things I haven't taught you yet, not because you weren't ready to learn them, but because I hoped you would never need them. Marcus slipped on the gloves, feeling the weight of history in the leather. But now I see that the world will test you whether you're prepared or not. Better that you face those tests with all the tools I can give you. As they began their training that night, Marcus understood that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer hiding from conflict or enduring injustice in silence. He had found the balance his father had been trying to teach him all along, the wisdom to choose his battles and the strength to win them when they couldn't be avoided. The next few weeks brought subtle changes to the social ecosystem of Westfield. Chase and his friends still moved through the hallways with their old swagger, but they gave Marcus a wide berth. More importantly, they seemed to have lost their appetite for targeting other vulnerable students. Other bullies took notice. The casual cruelty that had been accepted as normal teenage behavior began to carry new risks. Students who might have been easy targets started walking a little taller, wondering if they too might have hidden reserves of strength. Marcus remained largely invisible, but it was a different kind of invisibility now, the kind that suggested hidden depths rather than mere insignificance. He still worked alongside his father after school, still wore his patched clothes and carried his battered backpack, but when he walked through the hallways, other students stepped aside with respect rather than dismissal. The janitor's son had become something more dangerous than a fighter. He had become a symbol, a reminder that power structures could be overturned, that dignity couldn't be taken away without a fight, and that sometimes the quietest people carried the loudest warnings. Chase learned to live with his crooked nose and his diminished status. His friends learned to find entertainment that didn't involve tormenting the helpless. Sophia walked the hallways with new confidence, knowing that someone had cared enough to risk everything for a stranger's safety. And Marcus learned that his father's greatest lesson hadn't been about fighting at all. It had been about knowing when to fight and why. In standing up for Sophia, he had discovered that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning.